There is a peculiar kind of captivity that most people experience without ever recognizing it. It does not involve chains. It requires no locked doors, no prison walls, no visible restraints. And yet it can occupy the mind for hours, days, sometimes even years. It often begins with something absurdly small. A melody. Just a few notes. A fragment of a chorus. A sequence of sounds lasting no more than a few seconds. The music ends. Life continues. You move on to other tasks. You answer messages, prepare meals, drive through traffic, scroll through your phone. But somewhere beneath all of it, the melody remains alive, repeating itself, again, and again, and again. Hours later, you realize it is still there. The same few notes cycling endlessly through your awareness, like a visitor who refuses to leave, like an echo that continues long after the original sound has disappeared. Most people dismiss this phenomenon as a harmless annoyance. A catchy song, a strange quirk of memory, a random neurological accident. But what if it is none of those things? What if this ordinary experience reveals something profound about the architecture of the human mind? What if the melody is not the real mystery? What if the real mystery is why the mind cannot let it go? The phenomenon is commonly known as an earworm, a song or melody that becomes trapped inside conscious awareness and repeats involuntarily. Scientists have spent decades studying why this occurs. The explanations often focus on memory, attention, and auditory processing. These explanations are valuable, but they may not reach the deepest layer of the phenomenon, because beneath the neuroscience lies a question that is almost philosophical. Why does the mind become attached to unfinished patterns? Why does incompleteness possess such power over human consciousness? To answer this question, we must first understand something essential about the nature of the mind. The human brain is not merely a recording device. It is not a passive observer. It is not content to simply witness reality. Instead, it constantly attempts to organize reality, to complete it, to resolve it, to transform chaos into coherence. Every moment of consciousness is shaped by this impulse. The brain seeks patterns, connections, conclusions. It wants stories to have endings, questions to have answers, problems to have solutions. And when those things are absent, something remarkable happens. The mind continues working, even when you are no longer paying attention, even when you believe you have moved on. The unfinished remains active. The incompleteness continues demanding energy. The unresolved problems refuse to disappear. This is why certain melodies become trapped inside consciousness. Many earworms contain something psychologically irresistible. A repeated phrase. An unresolved sequence. A hook that creates tension without fully satisfying it. The song appears complete on the surface, but somewhere within its structure exists a small gap. A tiny fragment of incompleteness. And the brain becomes fascinated by that gap. It returns repeatedly, trying to close it, trying to resolve it, trying to finish what feels unfinished. This tendency reveals something extraordinary. The earworm is not simply about music. It is about the fundamental relationship between consciousness and incompleteness. Because if you examine your own life carefully, you may notice that melodies are not the only things that behave this way. Thoughts do it. Memories do it. Relationships do it. Dreams do it. Regrets do it. The same mechanism that replays a melody can replay an argument from 10 years ago. The same force that keeps a chorus alive can keep an old heartbreak alive. The same psychological machinery that refuses to abandon a song can refuse to abandon an unanswered question. The melody is merely the most visible example. Beneath it lies a much deeper pattern. And that pattern follows many people throughout their entire lives. Imagine for a moment that someone approaches you with a story. They begin speaking. The opening is compelling. The characters are interesting. The tension grows. You become invested. Then suddenly, without warning, they stop speaking and walk away. No ending. No explanation. No conclusion. What happens next? Something inside you becomes uncomfortable. A subtle tension emerges. Your attention remains attached to the story. You begin imagining possible endings. You replay the details. You search for meaning. The unfinished narrative continues occupying mental space. Not because you chose to think about it, but because the mind dislikes incompleteness. This tendency appears everywhere. A text message arrives. You read it. You decide to respond later. Hours pass. Yet part of your attention remains attached to the unfinished conversation. A task remains incomplete. You continue thinking about it even while attempting other activities. An important decision remains unresolved. Your thoughts circle around it repeatedly. The mind behaves almost like a detective, relentlessly pursuing loose ends, obsessively seeking closure, refusing to leave mysteries unsolved. At first glance, this might appear irrational, but from an evolutionary perspective, it makes perfect sense. For most of human history, uncertainty carried consequences. An incomplete observation could mean danger. An unanswered question could affect survival. The individuals who paid attention to unresolved information often possessed an advantage. Their brains became specialists in detecting incompletion, specialists in noticing gaps, specialists in returning to unfinished problems until solutions emerged. Over thousands of generations, this tendency became deeply embedded within human cognition. The result is a mind that struggles to ignore what feels unfinished. A mind that continuously returns to unresolved patterns. A mind that treats incompletion as unfinished business. The problem is that modern life presents countless forms of incompletion that cannot be solved through thought alone. And this is where psychological suffering often begins. Because not every question has an answer. Not every story receives closure. Not every loss can be explained. Not every relationship can be repaired. Not every dream can be recovered. Yet the ancient machinery of the mind continues searching. It continues replaying. It continues analyzing. It continues attempting to finish what reality has left unfinished. This creates a strange conflict. Reality moves forward. The mind remains behind. Reality closes the chapter. The mind continues reading the same page. Reality accepts uncertainty. The mind demands certainty. And in this gap between reality and expectation, countless psychological loops are born. The earworm offers a perfect example. The melody has already ended. Objectively, nothing remains to be done. The music is over. Yet subjectively, the mind refuses to accept that fact. It continues processing, continues replaying, continues searching for completion. What appears to be a minor annoyance is actually a glimpse into one of the deepest mechanisms governing human consciousness. The need for completion. The need for closure. The need to transform uncertainty into certainty. Many people spend their entire lives unaware of how strongly this force shapes their experience. They assume their thoughts are random. Their obsessions accidental. Their mental loops meaningless. But often there is a hidden structure beneath them. A hidden logic. An invisible thread connecting countless experiences. The thread is incompletion. Consider how often your mind returns to the same subjects. The same memories. The same mistakes. The same fears. The same imagined futures. Notice how certain thoughts possess unusual persistence. They refuse to disappear. Not because they are necessarily important, but because they remain unresolved. The mind treats them like unfinished melodies, and so it returns. Again, and again, and again. The Russian novelist Dostoevsky understood something profound about this aspect of human nature. His characters often became trapped inside psychological loops. Not because they lacked intelligence, not because they lacked willpower, but because they could not stop returning to unresolved conflicts within themselves. A question haunted them. A contradiction tormented them. An unfinished struggle consumed them. And the more they attempted to escape it, the more power it seemed to gain. The modern world often interprets this tendency as weakness. It encourages constant positivity, constant movement, constant distraction. Whenever discomfort appears, people are urged to move on immediately, to think differently, to stay busy, to avoid dwelling on the past. Sometimes this advice can be useful, but it also risks overlooking something important. The mind does not create loops without reason. Every repetition contains information. Every recurring thought points toward something unfinished. Every earworm reveals a deeper principle. The challenge is learning to distinguish between what requires attention and what requires release. Because not every loop deserves endless analysis. And not every unfinished story can be completed. This distinction may be one of the most important psychological skills a person can develop. Some things require understanding. Others require acceptance. Some questions can be answered. Others must be abandoned. Some melodies can be resolved. Others must simply fade. The difficulty lies in recognizing which is which. And for many people, this becomes the central struggle of their inner lives. The struggle between holding on and letting go. The struggle between searching and accepting. The struggle between completion and surrender. The earworm may appear insignificant, a trivial curiosity, a minor inconvenience. But beneath its simplicity lies a mirror, a reflection of the deeper processes shaping human thought. A glimpse into the mind's relentless pursuit of resolution. A reminder that consciousness is not passive. It is active, restless, searching, forever attempting to transform uncertainty into certainty. And perhaps this explains why a simple melody can reveal so much about what it means to be human. Because the melody itself is never the real story. The real story is the mind that cannot stop listening. And once you understand that, a far more unsettling question emerges. If a few notes can imprison attention for hours, what happens when the unfinished thing is not a melody, but a memory? If a melody can remain trapped inside the mind for hours, then a memory can remain trapped for years. And unlike a song, a memory carries emotion. It carries meaning. It carries identity. Which means that when it begins to loop, the consequences become far more powerful. Think about the last time you replayed an old moment in your head. Perhaps it was a conversation. Perhaps it was a mistake. Perhaps it was an opportunity you failed to take. The event itself may have lasted only minutes. Yet somehow it continued occupying mental space long after it ended. Days became months. Months became years. And still the memory occasionally returned. Why does the mind insist on revisiting certain experiences while allowing thousands of others to disappear? Most people assume the answer is importance. They believe the mind replays certain memories because they matter more. But importance alone cannot explain it. There are deeply meaningful moments that fade surprisingly quickly. And there are trivial moments that linger for decades. A careless comment. An awkward interaction. A missed opportunity. A single sentence spoken at the wrong time. These memories often refuse to die. Not because they changed the world, but because they never found resolution inside the mind. The memory becomes a psychological earworm. An unfinished emotional melody. And the mind keeps returning to it, hoping to discover what it missed. This is one of the strangest habits of human consciousness. When something painful occurs, we rarely experience it only once. We experience it repeatedly. The original event happens in reality. Then it happens again in memory. And again. And again. Each replay feels like an attempt to solve the problem retroactively. As if one more examination might produce a different outcome. As if enough thinking could somehow alter the past. Of course it cannot. The past remains untouched. Yet the mind continues its investigation. Searching for a missing piece. Searching for closure. Searching for an answer that may not exist. Imagine a detective assigned to a case that can never be solved. Every morning he opens the same file. Studies the same evidence. Examines the same photographs. Creates new theories. Questions old assumptions. Yet no matter how hard he works, the final answer never arrives. Years pass. The investigation continues. Eventually the detective no longer works on the case because he believes it can be solved. He works on it because he cannot stop. Many people live this way psychologically. They become detectives investigating their own past. Searching endlessly for explanations. Trying to understand why a relationship ended. Why a parent behaved a certain way. Why an opportunity disappeared. Why they made a particular decision. Why life unfolded differently than expected. The search feels necessary. Sometimes even noble. But often it becomes a prison. Because some mysteries cannot be solved through analysis. Some experiences resist understanding. Some wounds remain partially unexplained. And yet the mind keeps searching. The reason is simple. The mind prefers a painful answer over no answer at all. Certainty feels safer than uncertainty. Even when that certainty hurts. This creates an interesting paradox. People often believe they fear painful truths. In reality, many people fear uncertainty even more. An unpleasant explanation can at least be understood. An unanswered question remains open forever. And the mind hates open endings. This is why breakups can be so psychologically devastating. Not merely because someone leaves, but because they often leave questions behind. What happened? What changed? Was it my fault? Could I have done something differently? The relationship ends in reality. But inside the mind, the story remains unfinished. And so the replay begins. Every conversation becomes evidence. Every memory becomes a clue. Every detail becomes part of an endless investigation. The person is gone. Yet psychologically they continue occupying space. Not because they are still present, but because the story never reached a satisfying conclusion. The same thing happens with regret. Regret is one of the most powerful forms of mental repetition. Unlike guilt, which focuses on what we did, regret often focuses on what we failed to do. The opportunity we ignored. The chance we never took. The words we never spoke. The life we never pursued. And because these possibilities never became reality, they remain strangely alive. A failed action has no ending. It exists forever as a question. What if? What if I had tried? What if I had stayed? What if I had left? What if I had spoken? What if I had remained silent? Notice how these questions resemble unfinished melodies. They never resolve. They simply repeat. And each repetition creates the illusion that resolution is close. The mind whispers that one more thought might finally reveal the answer. One more analysis. One more replay. One more journey into the past. Yet the answer never arrives. Because the real problem is not lack of information. The real problem is the refusal to accept uncertainty. This is why some people become trapped in rumination. Rumination appears productive. Feels like thinking. It feels like problem solving. It feels like progress. But often it is simply repetition disguised as insight. The same thoughts moving in circles. The same conclusions wearing different disguises. The same emotional loops replaying beneath new language. A person can spend years analyzing a wound without healing it. Years examining pain without releasing it. Years studying a problem that no longer requires understanding. Because understanding and acceptance are not the same thing. And many people mistake one for the other. They believe acceptance will arrive after perfect understanding. After every question is answered. After every mystery is solved. After every loose end is tied together. But life rarely works this way. Life leaves gaps. Life leaves contradictions. Life leaves unfinished chapters. And maturity often begins when we recognize that complete understanding is not always possible. Consider childhood. Almost everyone carries unfinished stories from childhood. Moments that were never explained. Needs that were never met. Questions that were never answered. A child may spend years wondering why a parent behaved a certain way. Why affection was inconsistent. Why approval felt conditional. Why understanding seemed absent. As the years pass, the child grows into an adult. But the questions remain. And because they remain unanswered, the mind keeps returning. Searching. Examining. Interpreting. The emotional loop continues. Not because the past is still happening, but because the story feels unfinished. This is why certain memories possess extraordinary durability. They are not merely memories. They are unresolved narratives. Stories without endings. And the mind, by its very nature, struggles to abandon unfinished stories. Yet there is something even more fascinating. The longer a loop continues, the more it begins to shape identity. At first, a memory is something you revisit. Eventually, it becomes something you live inside. The regret becomes part of how you see yourself. The heartbreak becomes part of how you understand love. The failure becomes part of how you define possibility. Without realizing it, people often build entire identities around unfinished experiences. A person no longer says, "I experienced rejection." Instead, they become the rejected person. They no longer say, "I failed." They become the failure. The unfinished story stops being something they remember. It becomes something they are. This transformation is subtle, almost invisible, but it changes everything. Because once an unfinished experience becomes part of identity, letting go feels dangerous. The loop no longer feels optional. It feels necessary. To release the story feels like releasing part of oneself. And so the mind continues replaying, not only seeking closure, but protecting identity, protecting familiarity, protecting a version of reality it has carried for years. This may explain why healing often feels frightening. People imagine healing as relief, and sometimes it is. But healing also involves loss. The loss of old narratives. The loss of familiar pain. The loss of identities built around unfinished stories. The mind resists this process, not because it enjoys suffering, but because it fears uncertainty. A painful identity still feels safer than an unknown one, and so many remain trapped between two worlds, unable to return to the past, unable to move fully into the future, caught inside repetition, caught inside memory, caught inside emotional earworms that continue playing long after the original event has ended. Yet there is a hidden lesson inside all of this. The lesson is not that memories are enemies, nor that regrets should be ignored, nor that painful experiences must be forgotten. The lesson is that repetition itself does not guarantee resolution. A song does not end because it repeats forever. A wound does not heal because it is examined endlessly. A memory does not transform simply because it is revisited thousands of times. At some point, a different response becomes necessary. A response that is neither avoidance nor obsession, neither suppression nor endless analysis. Something else. Something more difficult. Something that requires a person to stop asking whether the past can be changed, and start asking whether the present can be lived. Because there comes a moment in every psychological journey when the search for answers reaches its limit. A moment when the mind finally encounters a truth it cannot think its way around. A truth both liberating and terrifying. The truth that some chapters never close themselves. And if they are ever to lose their power, we must learn how to live with unfinished pages. There comes a point in every psychological struggle when thinking can no longer carry us forward. For a long time, the mind believes it can solve its suffering through analysis. It believes that one more insight will finally bring peace. One more memory revisited. One more explanation discovered. One more layer uncovered. And then, at last, the burden will disappear. But eventually something unexpected happens. The search begins to exhaust itself. The same questions return. The same conclusions emerge. The same loops continue spinning. And slowly, often painfully, a realization begins to form. The problem is no longer the absence of answers. The problem is the addiction to searching for them. This realization can feel almost offensive. After all, human beings are taught that persistence is a virtue. That every mystery can be solved. That every problem has a solution. That enough effort can overcome any obstacle. But the deeper realities of life refuse to obey these rules. Some questions remain unanswered. Some losses remain permanent. Some stories never reveal their meaning. And no amount of thinking can change that fact. The philosopher is forced to confront uncertainty. The grieving heart is forced to confront absence. The searching mind is forced to confront limits. And this confrontation is often where true transformation begins. Because there is a profound difference between a problem and a condition. A problem can be solved. A condition must be accepted. Many people mistakenly treat life's deepest conditions as if they were problems. Loneliness becomes a puzzle to solve. Regret becomes a puzzle to solve. Mortality becomes a puzzle to solve. Uncertainty becomes a puzzle to solve. But these experiences are woven into existence itself. They cannot be eliminated completely. Only understood differently. This is where many psychological loops lose their power. Not when they are solved, but when they are recognized for what they are. Imagine standing beside a river. At first, you attempt to stop the current. You push against it, fight it, resist it. The harder you struggle, the more exhausted you become. Eventually you discover something surprising. The river was never asking for your permission to flow. It was never waiting for your approval. It simply moves. Life often behaves the same way. The past moves where it wishes. Time moves where it wishes. Loss moves where it wishes. And suffering increases when we demand that reality behave differently. Acceptance is frequently misunderstood. Many people hear the word and imagine surrender, defeat, passivity, resignation. But genuine acceptance is something entirely different. Acceptance is seeing reality clearly without demanding that it become something else. It is the courage to stop arguing with what already exists. It is the strength to release impossible negotiations. The negotiation that says, if I think about it long enough, perhaps it never happened. If I analyze it deeply enough, perhaps I can undo it. If I understand it perfectly, perhaps the pain will disappear. These negotiations consume years of human life. Yet they never succeed. Reality remains unchanged. The past remains untouched. And eventually the mind must choose. Continue negotiating. Or begin living. This choice appears simple. In practice, it is one of the most difficult decisions a person can make. Because unfinished stories often become part of identity. A person who has carried a wound for years begins to know themselves through that wound. The pain becomes familiar, predictable, almost comforting in its consistency. Strange as it sounds, human beings often prefer familiar suffering over unfamiliar freedom. At least familiar suffering provides certainty. Freedom contains unknowns. To release an old story means entering territory without a map. Who am I without this regret? Who am I without this resentment? Who am I without this heartbreak? Who am I without this unfinished chapter? These questions frighten people because they reveal something unexpected. The loop was never merely a thought. The loop became a home. An uncomfortable home. A painful home. But a home nonetheless. Leaving it requires courage. And courage is not the absence of fear. It is movement despite fear. This is why healing rarely feels dramatic. It rarely arrives as a grand revelation. More often it arrives quietly. A memory appears. And for the first time the mind does not chase it. A regret surfaces. And for the first time the person does not follow it into endless analysis. An old emotional melody begins playing. And for the first time it fades on its own. Not because it was solved, but because it was no longer fed. This moment is subtle. Yet it represents a profound shift. The individual is no longer trapped inside the story. They are observing the story. A space has emerged between consciousness and content, between awareness and memory, between identity and experience. Within that space, freedom becomes possible. The ancient philosophers often return to a similar insight. Suffering is not created solely by events. It is created by attachment. Not attachment in the superficial sense, but attachment to how reality should have been. Attachment to alternative timelines. Attachment to imagined versions of the past. Attachment to outcomes that never occurred. The mind constructs these alternate realities endlessly. A life where the relationship succeeded. A life where the mistake never happened. A life where the opportunity was taken. A life where everything unfolded differently. And then it compares reality against imagination. Reality inevitably loses. Because imagination contains no limits, no accidents, no contradictions, no imperfections. The comparison becomes unfair from the beginning. Yet countless people spend years measuring their real lives against imaginary alternatives. The result is predictable: disappointment, frustration, bitterness, and above all, repetition. The endless replay of what might have been. But there is another possibility. A possibility hidden beneath the noise of mental repetition. The possibility of returning to the present. Not as an escape, not as a distraction, but as a homecoming. The present moment possesses a unique quality. Unlike memory, it is alive. Unlike regret, it can be influenced. Unlike imagination, it is real. Every meaningful change occurs here. Not in yesterday. Not in tomorrow. Here. And yet the mind spends astonishing amounts of energy everywhere except here. It revisits old wounds. It predicts future disasters. It wanders through unfinished stories. All while life continues unfolding in the only place where action is possible. The present. This may be why so many wisdom traditions emphasize attention. Not because attention solves every problem, but because attention interrupts unnecessary suffering. It breaks identification with mental loops. It reveals that thoughts are events occurring within consciousness. Not commands, not truths, not identities, just events. Passing through, appearing, disappearing. Like clouds moving across the sky. The sky does not cling to clouds. It allows them to pass. Consciousness can learn the same lesson. And perhaps this brings us back to the earworm. To that simple melody trapped inside the mind. At first glance, it appears insignificant. A random annoyance. A curious psychological glitch. But look deeper. The earworm is a miniature version of something much larger. It reveals the mind's obsession with completion. Its resistance to uncertainty. Its inability to release unfinished patterns. The melody becomes a mirror. A reflection of countless invisible processes shaping human experience. The same force that repeats a chorus repeats a regret. The same force that loops a melody loops a memory. The same force that seeks resolution in music seeks resolution in life. And yet life does not always provide resolution. Sometimes it offers ambiguity. Sometimes contradiction. Sometimes silence. The mature mind learns to tolerate these things. Not because they are pleasant, but because they are real. This tolerance becomes a form of wisdom. A willingness to live without total certainty. A willingness to move forward without complete closure. A willingness to accept that some mysteries remain mysteries. And perhaps that is what growth ultimately means. Not becoming someone who has all the answers, but becoming someone who no longer needs all the answers. Not becoming someone untouched by pain, but someone no longer ruled by it. Not someone who completes every story, but someone capable of living beyond unfinished stories. The irony is that when this transformation occurs, many loops dissolve naturally. The mind stops fighting, stops demanding, stops chasing, and what was once overwhelming begins to lose its grip. The memory remains, but it no longer dominates. The regret remains, but it no longer defines. The question remains, but it no longer controls. Even the melody eventually fades, not because it was defeated, not because it was solved, but because attention finally moved elsewhere, toward life, toward presence, toward reality itself. And perhaps this is the final lesson hidden inside every earworm. The song is not the enemy. The memory is not the enemy. The unfinished chapter is not the enemy. The true struggle has always been our inability to tolerate incompleteness. Our insistence that every story must end neatly. Every question must receive an answer. Every wound must be fully explained. Life offers no such guarantee. It never has. It never will. Yet strangely, this realization contains freedom. Because the moment we stop demanding perfect closure from existence, existence becomes lighter. The burden begins to loosen. The mind begins to soften. The endless replay slows. And in the quiet that follows, something extraordinary appears. Not certainty. Not resolution. Not a final answer. But peace. A peace that does not depend on completion. A peace that does not require explanation. A peace that exists alongside uncertainty rather than eliminating it. The melody ends. The memory settles. The search grows silent. And for the first time, perhaps, we understand that freedom was never hidden inside the answer. Freedom was hidden inside our willingness to stop demanding one.